Hello, my name is J. William Zoldak, and I'm a children's author. And I'd like to read you a story today. I've written several books in my time about incidents that happened in my life during the 1940s and 1950s. I write them in the form of letters that addressed to my grandchildren. I do it that way because I'd like to see them know a little bit about how things took place back in the 1940s and 50s when I was a child. And this is one of the stories. Grandpa's Day at the Circus. That's the name of this story. And as you can see, it's in the form of a letter, and I'll start reading it in that way. Dear grandchildren, I know that in the not too distant past, some of you attended the Ringley Brothers Circus as part of its farewell tour. I'm glad that you had a chance to experience the greatest show on earth before it passed away into history. I'm reminded of an experience that I had as a young boy with the circus many years ago in the 1950s. I would like to share that experience with you in this letter. The circus would come to our town periodically as part of its yearly circuit. It didn't come every year, but when it did come, it always created great excitement in the community. The time that I remember occurred in a section of town called Fircliffe, in a large open field that no longer exists. Fircliffe was about a mile from my grandmother's house in a place that I knew well. The field was owned by the carpet company that was located there. I assume the circus was arranged by the company for the enjoyment of the town. The Firth Carpet Company was the largest employer in our town. This illustration shows the factory or the mill where the carpet company was. And we can think of it in terms of the field that in front of it is where the circus was set up. This is an illustration of my bedroom, and as I read on, you can see how that fits into the story. I had heard that the circus would sometimes hire local kids to help with setup and would pay them by giving them free tickets to the show that night. As a boy of 12, this really appealed to me. So I got up early on the day that the circus was expected to be in town, and I walked over to see if I could get a job. When I arrived, I found the field full of trucks of animals and circus people. Because this was my first time experiencing this, I didn't know how to go about getting a job. So I walked around bewildered. There seemed to be different areas of the circus set up in some kind of loose order. In one large area, there were workers rolling out what turned out to be a huge tent, the big top, using elephants to move the equipment around and carrying heavy poles. I recognized several of the kids who were among the helpers and wondered how they got their jobs. By the time I got around to asking, I was told that no more help was needed setting up the tent. Not knowing what to do, I simply wandered around asking if anyone needed help. In this illustration, you can see that the elephants, as they're helping out and setting up things. Finally, I passed a place where there were several horses, perhaps 8 or 10 of them, all grayish blue in color and tied up next to a trailer and eating hay. There were a couple of men tending the horses, so I walked up to one of them and asked if I could help them. Because I was familiar with horses and had worked at a stable since I was 8 years old, I hoped they might consider me. To my surprise, a man named Tiny he was quite the opposite, said yes. I was overjoyed and spent the next few hours cleaning, and brushing these beautiful animals. They're called Liberty horses, a term that I didn't know until years later meant that they were horses that were specially chosen and trained to do tricks in response to voice commands. I, of course, knew none of this at the time. I only knew that I was accepted for a job. In this photograph, you can see that Tiny standing in front of it. Tiny, as I said, was a big man, not tiny at all. After most of the work was done, I sat with Tiny and the other men talking and joking around. The men took turns sharing experiences and boasting about things that they had done or were able to do. For example, at one point, Tiny grabbed a sledgehammer and started doing a trick. He held the hammer straight out with one hand, and then he tipped the heavy head of the hammer back toward his face. As it got closer to his face, he slowed the motion down to bring it to the end of his nose. After touching his nose, he slowly raised it back again. I was sure that his strength would give out and he would hit himself in the face, but he never did. He then handed me the hammer and asked if I would like to try. I emphatically declined. Over the next few years, however, I did try to do it, and eventually, with a lot of practice, accomplished it. This illustration shows Tiny handing me the hammer with the horses in the background. And this one shows my grandmother in the kitchen, and you'll see how she fits into the story as I read on. Just before lunch, I asked Tiny if I would be able to get free tickets to the circus that night. He told me not to worry because he would get me in when the time came. I then ran to my grandmother's house for lunch. After eating quickly, I returned to the circus. My grandmother packed me some sandwiches to have for supper, so I didn't have to leave the circus again before the show. When I returned, Tiny and the other men were still relaxing, but as time went on, they started preparing for the show that night. At one point, Tiny asked one of the other men if he thought that a particular horse needed new shoes. When the man said yes, they decided to get it done immediately because the show time was approaching rapidly. They then did something that I had never heard of before or since, but I swear it happened horse at the same time. Tiny worked on the right rear hoof at the same time that the other man worked on the left front hoof. Each man leaned into the horse, balancing the horse while it stood on only the other 2 feet. They then switched feet and did it again. The horse had 4 new shoes in record time. I was amazed, as were the other people who saw it. When I asked Tiny if he had ever done that before, he said no, but he always wondered if he could. This illustration shows the horse being worked on by the 2 men at the same time. Just before the circus was to begin, I asked Tiny again about getting a seat for the show. He said that he might need me to help because one of the men that was supposed to lead the horses into the ring hadn't arrived yet. I told him that I would be happy to help. He then brought me into the circus through the performer's entrance to a front row seat. It was probably the best seat in the tent. Partway through the show, he came back to tell me that the man had finally arrived, so I didn't have to lead the horses in after all. This is showing, in this illustration, me and Tiny walking in through the performer's entrance and him showing me to front row seat that was almost perfect. This gives you an idea of how the show in the ring, we have the horses in the ring, the Liberty horses, and it shows the act as it was being performed during the circus. I enjoyed the show greatly, but I must say, I do wish the man had not shown up so that I could tell you that your grandfather once led the Liberty horses into the ring of one of the greatest shows on earth. I do say, however, that it was a wonderful experience and one that I will never forget. Well, that's my circus story. The next day, the circus moved on to the next town, and I never saw Tiny or the Liberty horses again. But oh, what a great memory. The big top, the wild animals, the clowns, the elephants, the trapeze artists, all the other acts, and of course the Liberty horses have now moved into history. But that day lives on within me. You too will have wonderful, unexpected experiences in your life that you will cherish. Hold on to them and share them, because each time you do, they will enrich your life over and over again. I can assure you that while I only spent one day with Tiny, I think of him often and as a special friend. Love, as always, Grandpa. And this last illustration, you can see way up in the top, Tiny tipping his hat as he leaves. I, of course, was not in the field at the time that that happened. There's also in the forefront an old program indicating that there had been a circus there, but that's the only indication that the circus had ever been in that field. When I had come back the next morning, the field was empty, with the exception of that one program. And I never saw Tiny or the Liberty horses again. But it was a wonderful time and a wonderful experience. And I hope all of you listening to me will have great experiences also in your life. It probably won't be the circus, because the circus has now gone into history and no longer exists. Thank you for listening. I appreciate spending time with you. And I